Do me a favor. The live stream fairies, I guess. No, I told Lori today that if there's any issues, it's just, All right, very good evening. If you're joining us on live stream, we're glad to have you with us on live stream. And for all of you that are here this evening, so glad to have you back with us tonight with our second evening of this grief workshop. We have with us Ron and Dawn Williams, who we met last night. Really my first time to meet them face to face and everything. Heard a lot about them for many years, and so glad to have them with us. And last night was wonderful. We appreciate all the effort that was put in. So tonight we're going to continue that with some lessons that they have. Tonight was first Ron's going to speak to us, and then Don will speak to us afterwards. Now tomorrow evening, if you're listening online as well as here, tomorrow and tomorrow evening, they will continue to be with us. But tomorrow morning, there'll be two classes simultaneously. There'll be one here in the auditorium and the other one in the fellowship hall. And the auditorium is talking about how do we minister to families and those who have chronic illnesses and other things other than just loss. And so that'll be here in the auditorium. And then in the fellowship hall, Ron's going to be dealing with, or how to deal with, basically dealing with children and grief, essentially for families that have children and how you minister to them as well in their grief. And so all very useful material and information. So without waiting any longer, let's go ahead and begin with a prayer and we will get started. Father God, we thank you for this evening that you blessed us with to be able to come here, to be able to hear and study these things, Father, that pertain to helping those, ministering to those that are grieving, and to help those who are grieving, Father. We just pray you continue to be with Ron and Dawn Williams as they are working in your kingdom, Father, and glad that they're here with us. Give them a ready recollection of all the things that they prepared, and help us, Father, in understanding those things. As we pray and ask in Jesus' name, amen. Brother Ron. And tomorrow evening, we'll continue with some practical applications about ministering to those. It'll be during our regular worship service. Which one of these you want to pass out?
Whatever everybody needs to know.
Oh, you already got everybody? Yes, sir.
We appreciate so much you spending Saturday night with us, and we're very blessed to be able to be with you. The class tomorrow morning will be for adults, what adults need to know about children and grief. Obviously, as Don mentioned earlier last evening, children do grieve. Unfortunately, they get overlooked, they get isolated, and unfortunately their feelings do not get validated. And so we want to try to talk about some very practical things that will be helpful in the fellowship hall on that. For the worship hour, we're going to look at a biblical approach to the idea of grief as we look at what Jesus did in dealing with someone that he loved. And then tomorrow evening, as he's already mentioned, we'll be dealing with, at 6 o'clock, Don will be dealing with tremendously practical things that people in their time of grief said helped them more than anything else. And so we're going to give you a very practical list of things that help, that work. So oftentimes we use the argument, I just don't know what to do. We're going to take away that argument, that thought in regard to what we have to say. A lady came up to us one time and she said, I'm grieving, and I have been grieving for years because of what happened to my family. And she explained the situation. She had several family members in her family that had been lost in a plane accident, there was their own personal plane accident. They were traveling from this part of the country over into Colorado, places to snow ski. The plane got lost. They assumed it crashed. They did not know it was in the middle of a snowstorm. And for months, they wondered where their loved ones were. The lady went on to explain, because of that terrible not knowing situation, my dad eventually died. The next spring, they found the debris of the plane. 4 different family members that she had, very close members of her family, died. And she said it was all over, just started like it was just yesterday, when she had to go back and start again dealing with the reality of that loss. She said, it's affected me in several different ways. Not only did I lose all of those loved ones and have to go back and rewind and replay all of those events that led up to this point in time, I lost our dad, who died because of all of this. He just could not handle. He was not in the best of health already, and he could not handle all the agony of not knowing. And so he eventually died from that. And she said, it's been a rough time for me spiritually speaking. And we were just listening to her. I said, yes, ma'am. She said, I found it hard to pray. In fact, there were times I could not pray. What do you pray for? I knew that God cared. That was never an issue. It's just that I could not force myself, in her case, to pray. She said, I've changed that. I'm able to pray now. Said, I never missed a church service. That was never an issue. My faith in God, never a problem. But said, there was just something about the prayer situation that I just could not fathom. She said today, and said the church here knows about this, if it's our curriculum study of the book of Job, guess what? I will not be here. I will go to another Bible class, but I said I cannot to this day handle the book of Job. Could you somewhat relate to what this lady was going through? And the reason I mentioned that, and we thanked her so much for her sharing that with 2 total strangers, so to speak, is that there's so many things about grief that we don't know that we ought to know. And thus the handout that you have there in front of you may be cathartic and useful for you as you try to help others in those scenarios that I've just mentioned, because that lady's name is Legion when it comes to other situations of life that we run into. You know, COVID obviously did a number on people in regard to their situations of life. If they were already going through problems, COVID 2020, 2021, even 2022, exacerbated that situation, made it even much worse. Terry and I were talking. I know up north Alabama, and I'm sure it was not just in Alabama, that police departments, sheriff departments, state troopers had far greater times with domestic violence, with violence done against children, with people just in ill, terrible health, people with just a terrible way of looking at their life and dealing with other individuals, people in our neighborhood, because we couldn't go away from, people got caustic. People got, and they let everybody know on Facebook how they felt, and it was not nice. It was not good. It was not a real kind way of but it was just a terrible way of dealing with grief. Here are some suggestions. Grief should be a healthy and a natural consequence when a person loses something or someone significant to them. Now, what are the key words in that statement? Consequence. Knowing, any kind of situation that produces grief, that produces loss, there's a consequence there. And what this lady was telling us at a workshop years ago was, because of all the different losses that came from several different places, these are the consequences that I've had to deal with. And it had taken her several years to get to that point that she has said, I can pray now. I just can't go back and study Job. I just can't do it right now. We live in a world today that many people would question whether it's natural and healthy for a person to grieve. Why? Why would you think some people would think it'd be unnatural and unhealthy for people to grieve?
Maybe they think you're just supposed to move on. People think you're supposed to just move on.
Okay, they think they should move on.
A lot of people don't like to show emotion.
People do not like to. Some people don't like to show emotions.
They rehash emotions for other people, but they don't want to. They remember when it was them. They could rehash those kinds of emotions.
Exactly. Yeah. We don't want to have to. Grief takes energy. Grief takes time. Grief takes a process. It's a process. And a lot of people just like to give me a shot and let me go on. We typically ask this question, and we don't mean any disrespect at all. Do we have, and I obviously can't ask the folks online this or not. You can raise your hand and indicate to Troy if you want to. Anybody here from the great state of Ohio? Okay, we do have one volunteer. Okay, well, I have an idea that it was not you that was involved in this study that was done several years ago. Here's what they did. They went to a little town in Ohio, on the street corner downtown where everybody was shopping on a Saturday, I think it was, and they basically asked 250 people this question. No, 500 people. 500 people this question. If you dealt with losses in your life and you lost either a mom or a dad, a husband or a wife, or a son or a daughter, or a brother or a sister, which are obviously the closest relationships we have in life, they asked these individuals, how long do you think it would take you to get over your grief? Now, over 251 of them, the majority of them answered one particular length of time. What do you think the average answer was? A year. What do you say?
My answer would be never. But
Never.
I would say,
Okay.
I would say probably
Kim, what about you?
never.
Never. We'll ask the Mr. Ohio himself. What do you think they would say it?
As an Ohioan, I would say about
Would say what?
I would say about never.
Okay, about never. Over 251, the greater majority, said between 6 weeks and 2 months.
Cold-hearted people.
Curious to know what town that goes.
I have no, and I don't know.
Well, did they experience any loss?
Excellent point. It's very evident that those people had never, ever experienced, the greater majority of them had never experienced real grief. They were just sort of shooting from the hip. But the point I wanted to make is that some people feel that way. Basically, the statistics are 1 out of 5 people that you meet every day have an idea of what grief is. 1 out of 5. Which means that if you're dealing with grief and 5 different people speak to you, guess what 4 of them are going to say?
Get over it.
Yeah. Yeah. You want your shot? Get over this. And I've heard that over and over again. We had a lady who was told that if she did not start acting better at work because of the loss of her daughter, and she was grieving over, this had been 3 months after her daughter had died, and they said, you're bringing too much negativity into the workplace. If you don't change, we're going to have to do something. Wow. That hurts in a lot of different ways. But just understand that some people don't see grief as something natural and healthy and has a consequence. They see it as, let me just get through this and move on. Number 2, it affects us with our whole being, emotionally. See, that's why grief tires us out, because we deal with the emotions when we're grieving, regardless of whether it's a loss of something or someone. Emotional. What are some of the emotions of grief? Sadness. Anger. You know, the ones on the whiteboard last night. All of those are dealing with the emotions of grief. And they just can wear you out. And yet they have to be dealt with, because for you in your life, that's what you're going through. Physically speaking, how does grief affect you physically? Don't want to get up in the morning. Can't sleep. Or don't eat. Or just the opposite. Some people have said that before grief, they never sighed, but now they a lot, because the way they feel. Okay. Just don't feel good. In fact, I remember someone that came to a class one time, a support class that I taught, and the reason they did was they'd gone to the doctor and said, something's wrong with us, something's wrong with me. And she started giving the symptoms, and he said, do I remember that something tragically happened in your family recently? Yeah. You're dealing with some of the physical sensations of grief. And he wanted her and her husband to come to my class. Mentally speaking, foggy brain. Things are not clear. You just can't plan from A to B to C to D. It's hard to do that. We talked about that somewhat last night. But you know, the more problematic your grief is, from a lot of different factors, the greater the potential, the possibility in regard to those mental. And I'm not saying it's not that you're insane. It's just that you just, at this point in time, can't clearly see what you would typically do. It's hard to make plans. It's hard to think through things. Spiritually speaking, grief affects us spiritually speaking? How so? What?
Want to question God.
We want to question God. Is it okay to question God? Sure it is. I've had people tell me, I'm sure Don as well, I'm so mad at God I said, fine. Fine. I said, yeah. I said, do you think you're the first person ever to be mad at God? I said, there's a whole list of people in the Bible that had, and the first one would be Job. He didn't understand why he was grieving or why he was being afflicted with everything he was being afflicted for. And he didn't know the rest of the story like you and I know it. But it's okay to be mad at God. I always tell people, I said, sure, let's be mad at God. Don't ever give up on him because he's not giving up on you. In one of my grief support classes, usually there's a week that I talk about God, grief, and religion. And sometimes we talk about the difficulty that's involved, for example, of reading the Bible, praying, coming back to church. You ever thought about how hard that might be for somebody? Alone, because your mate's no longer with you, or your family or friends or others. Where do you sit? Do you sit in the same place you always sat? Or do you sit with someone else? Or does someone else come and sit with you? I mean, you see the point. I've had family members and church members that have talked about how, I just dread coming back to church. I know I need to be there, and I know that's where I'll get the support that I need. But the first time, I've told them, I said, come late, leave early. Walk in before the actual service starts, but sit somewhere else. And then if you need to leave, then you can leave after service is over, and that way you won't be meeting as many people as you typically do. But we were in this discussion talking about this kind of thing. Because there's a real possibility sometimes that people in their grief and dealing with grief, their situation, the aftermath of it, it becomes a very great problem to them in regard to walking into a building and knowing and visualizing their loved one that's no longer there anymore. So it was in that kind of conversation that a lady spoke up and she said this. She said, when I walk into my building where my husband and I used to worship before his death, in my mind, I am the closest to him this side of eternity that I'll ever be until I leave this life. He's on the other side in the presence in paradise of God. I'm on this side. But in my opinion and in my thought, I am the closest that I can possibly be. She said, I look forward to every worship assembly together. When she said that, my mouth went, and I said, ma'am, thank you for saying that. But just realize that as individuals, that grief can affect us spiritually. And that's okay. That's all right. Grief can be a multifaceted emotion. There's really no stage-by-stage progression. Don mentioned a little bit about that last night when he showed the ball of grief, the denial being in the middle. There's no reason to go into a lot of discussion there, but 1969, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, Dr. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, wrote her classic book on death and dying. And she came up with 5 stages: denial, and anger, and bargaining, and depression, and then acceptance. She did that for an oncology group of terminal patients in New York State. She never meant for that 5-stage model to become the model. But in 1969, 1970, we didn't have anything. So everybody sort of just took it and said, there it is. We got a model now. And unfortunately, in the 70s and the 80s and even in the 90s, we sort of forced people through that pigeonhole of those 5 stages. And then finally, thanatologists and psychiatrists and psychologists and medical doctors figured it out. You know, not everybody feels these things. Maybe it's as uniquely their grief as it ought to be. And so now you don't find the 5-stage model to be as prevalent now as it was back then. How many of you ever been to Huntsville, Alabama, U.S. Space and Rocket Center? Okay, you know probably that we have a mock-up of the original rocket that went to the moon in 1969. It's a 5-stage model, okay? And it literally works the way it's supposed to work. By the way, if you haven't been there in a few years, inside the building, the new building, they've got one of the original engines of that 5-stage model in the building. It's one of only 3 in the world. Of course, one is no longer here because it's the one that took man to the moon. But you know, that's stage by stage. Grief doesn't work that way. We just sort of in and out. It's like a roller coaster. It's just sort of, you know, wild and woolly sometimes. So just understand that when you're dealing with people and you're trying to help them, don't pigeonhole them with, okay, let's go back to Kubler-Ross, which, by the way, before she passed away, she said, I never meant this to be the model. It just sort of happened that way. Grief can be a result of many kinds of losses. That's what we did last night with dealing with loss. There are all kinds of things that produce grief as well. Look at number 6. Oh, I think we skipped number 3. Grief is always an individual matter. It is. We are each uniquely our own when we deal with grief. Even in a family, even in a church family, all of us would be different. And we've got to remember that. Look at number 6. A person's feelings of grief will be directly affected by the significance of that loss. The intensity and duration of that grief will be proportionate to the depth of the love. Mathematical equation. Love plus loss equals grief. The love we had for that individual or the situation that we're involved in, plus the enormity of the loss that we're going to feel, will therefore equal the idea of the grief that we're going to face. Again, remember, husband, wife, mom, dad, brother, sister, son, daughter. Those are all the closest relationships we have in life. Think about if you ever had to experience that, what the love that you had for those individuals, plus what it means to deal with the loss. That tells you why you're going to grieve and how you're going to grieve. Anybody know the name C.S. Lewis? C.S. Lewis, interesting British scholar, great theologian, also a children's writer. Chronicles of Narnia, the Lion, the Witch, the Wardrobe. Professor of theology at, I think it was Cambridge and somewhere else in England. He started out as an atheist and worked his way through to understanding that there had to be a God. He just knew it because of all the things that he dealt with. Well, here's the interesting thing about him. toward the end of it, he was a bachelor all of his life until he met someone. He married her, an American, and they had a wonderful life together until she got sick with cancer. In his little book, and it's written from a British mindset, his book entitled A Grief Observed, very small little book. And it's a little hard to read because, again, he's British and we're not. But he made the point that grief is the price we pay for love. Think about that. Grief is the price we pay for love. When we were wondering, well, why are you grieving? Well, look at what my loss talks about. Look at all the different changes that I have to make because of that loss. Couple that with the love that I still have for that person or for that situation that's no longer in my life. That's why we grieve. And I don't know about you, but when someone questions about, you mean you're still grieving over that now? I like to remember this little equation here because it makes me feel better of knowing that I'm okay because my loss is great because my love was out of this world. And so the next time, and basically what number 6 says is the closer you are to the relationship, the greater the potential the loss is going to be. That's the whole point of what number 6 says. The closer you are to that relationship, whatever that relationship is, it's like this. Tomorrow morning, likely, you'll have church announcements and you will mention someone that is sick here in the congregation or someone that's connected to this congregation that's sick. Don and I will feel very sad for that individual and we'll try to remember their name and pray for them. But we don't have any connection with them besides just right here, right now. Now, if we heard tonight that someone from the Northport congregation where we grew up, where mom and dad were there for 56 years, suddenly and tragically were killed, are we going to hurt? Yeah, because you see, we had a connection there. And we had a 56-year connection perhaps with that individual. The closer you are to the relationship, the greater the potential, the loss. So when you're dealing with someone, and Don mentioned this in regard to disenfranchised grief, but the point of the matter is sometimes people will say, why are you grieving over that? And the question, and the reason is, because my loss is great because of my love. And that's why I'm going to grieve, and you're not going to get my way because I'm going to continue to grieve because I love them so much. But I appreciate so much what C.S. Lewis did. By the way, they turned it into a movie. They turned his love story into a movie. Anybody remember back in the 1980s? Wow, that dates just, doesn't it? Okay. Somewhere in the 1980s, there was an American movie called Shadowlands. Shadowlands. If you can find it, it's a great movie. Anthony Hopkins played C.S. Lewis. Deborah Winger played his wife. Great movie. Really interesting.
Is it Lands?
Shadowlands.
Land, L-A-N?
Lands. Yeah, they actually turned it. It started out as a British play, came over to America. My wife and I actually saw it at the Shakespeare Festival in Montgomery years ago. Did you really?
I was at Faulkner.
Yeah, yeah. But it's like I said. But C.S. Lewis had a lot. He had a lot on the ball in regard to understanding what love is and what grief is. So just remember, the closer we are to the relationship, the greater the potential of the loss. Number 7.
Let me go back.
Go ahead.
Something he said in that book, I think it was, he said that people didn't know how to react to him as a widower. And that he said, I hate it when they try to come up and talk to me, and I hate it when they don't. And he said, somebody's been avoiding me for a week. And he said, perhaps widows and widowers just need to be put in a leper colony and be treated that way, because that's the way he felt.
Yeah, the book was written in the 1940s or 50s, where they actually had leper colonies still in England. And that's what he said. He said, that ought to take those of us who are grieving and just go put us in a leper colony. That's the way we're being treated. Good point. Good point. Look at number 7. Thanks for mentioning that, Don. Once a person has dealt with some loss, they'll not be the same person. Now that sounds simplistic and sounds like, well, that's common sense. But you'd be surprised how many people think, what's wrong with them? Why aren't they the jovial self they used to be? Why are they so serious all the time? They've dealt with grief. They dealt with grief. Does anybody remember what happened to Jesus when he found out that John, his cousin, John the Immerser, had been killed by Herod, really by a decree of Herod? Anybody remember what Jesus did? He went up into the mountain by himself all night. I think he had to process what the rest of his life meant, what the rest of his ministry meant, without his cousin John being and doing the things that John had done, and feeling terrible, I'm sure, although he had not caused it, but feeling terrible about John's family, his mom, his dad, Elizabeth and Zacharias and others, if they were still living. Grief affects us differently. And we need to remember that. And then look at the last one. There's no real set time limits in regard to a person's grief process. One does not get over grief. Thanatologists will tell you that as long as a person is grieving normally, they can and they will grieve for a lifetime, and that is okay. If you've lost your mom and dad, do you ever want to forget their love? No. If you've lost a child or a spouse, do you ever want to forget them? No, you don't want to do that. Because we're afraid that by forgetting them, we forget what they meant to us. It's okay to grieve. There's no set time limit. There's no, you gotta, end of date. There's none of that. It's okay to grieve. Don's going to take us. Oh, one more thing. In case you're interested in any of the books in the back, the first book that we wrote in 1996, now with its 9th printing, is the book Walking with Those Who Weep. We call that Grief 101. If you wanted a basic book about just so understanding about grief, that's the book to look for. In 1998, Don wrote a book, Hope for Those Who Struggle, dealing with specific kinds of losses. Loss of a spouse, loss of a mate, a child, loss of parents, suicide, and other. So it deals with specific kinds of losses. And then a couple of years ago, someone called us and said, there's not a church brochure on grief been written since 1950. What are you guys going to do about it? So we got busy real quick and got that done right before. Of course, we did not know this was going to happen, but we actually had it the first week of February of 2020. You know what happened in March. But it's a brochure. It'd be a great thing to hand to someone. They're $1 a piece. Just to hand to someone that's family, friends, neighbor, just say, hey, don't know what you're going through. Maybe this will help. And that's what those little brochure books are about. Ron mentioned the idea that we don't want to ever forget our loved ones. We had a special moment coming up here. Anybody ever been to Flomaton, Alabama? It'd been I don't know if I've ever been through Flomaton, but that's where my mom and her parents lived. And so we were, and Ron had gone several years. He'd gone several years ago with them to a reunion on that side of the family. And so we were looking for the church building. And sure enough, we found the church building. And really a special story. But I just sort of relived some of this. Mom grew up in a denominational church, but her last year, I'm not doing something right. Okay. Let's try this one more time. Maybe that'll work. She had the opportunity to finish her senior year early by, because she'd gone to some classes in summer school, and they allow folks sometimes back in the country, they lived out in the country, to do that. And so in order to be able to do that, she needed to stay in town because her family lived and worked off the farm, and they couldn't drive back and forth every day, working on the farm like that. And so there was a lady, a member of the church, Mamie Totten was her name, and she bought eggs from her folks. And so they asked her, would you be willing for Dorothy, to stay with you Monday through Friday, and we'll pay you for her to do that, and then we'll come and get her on the weekend and bring her back. And she said yes. She and her husband agreed to allow this 17-year-old young lady to come and to live with them, which was very, very special. Well, she attended the Church of Christ, and so out of respect to her, Mom would begin to go to church services with her on Wednesday nights. And then they'd come and pick her up on Friday afternoons, and then they would bring her back on Sunday afternoons, and they would get there in time for worship services. And they began to realize that what they had been taught all those other years were in conflict with what they were teaching within the confines of the Church of Christ, and began to see that that was the truth. And so my grandmother got the denominational minister and the minister from the Church of Christ to come to their house to talk about the differences under a pecan tree, as the story goes. And it wasn't long before you could see what the truth was, because one had the truth of God's word and the other did not. And so they became New Testament Christians. And then when she graduated from there, the Brother Lucas, who was the minister of that congregation, said she needs to go to a Christian school. I know one place called Henderson Station, Tennessee, called Freed Hardeman College. So Mom went sight unseen on a train from Mobile all the way to Henderson Station, Tennessee, and then providentially met our dad, and of course the rest is history. But we relived those moments. And this was the strange thing. As I was calling my wife to tell her, hey, we just came through Flomaton, And we just saw the building where Mom was baptized 70 years ago, or 60, whatever the years ago, 60, whatever, 60, 89, 72 years ago. I looked up, now this gives me chills, because I looked up as we were driving, and I was just talking on the phone, and the road that we were passing was Welch Street, and my mom's name was Welch. Didn't that give you some of the heebie-jeebies? It did to me. So yeah, you relive moments, and we don't want to forget those things, and that's really, really important. Somebody has suggested, Doug Manning has suggested 3 great suggestions that we need to keep in mind, and then we'll take a break after this, before the second session. Doug Manning from Hereford, Texas, has written a great deal on this, and he says, first of all, you just need to get by. What is getting by? Getting by may mean getting up out of bed. A lot of times people just talk about, hey, that's the last thing I want to do. I just want to stay in bed. If I'm sleeping, I'm not thinking about it. Well, you may be dreaming about it, but still, getting by may mean just getting up. You're beginning to you're just trying to get through it.
Forcing yourself to eat because you know you have to.
Forcing yourself to eat, yes. I've seen it go both ways. I've had people who talked about not eating at all, and then I've seen people who've gained, 15 pounds within, a month, because that's something that takes the time. Secondly, he said you just try to get better. Getting better may be going back to church for the first time. It may be going to the grocery store for the first time. There's some people, we take that for granted, but for some folks who have lost a loved one, especially if that loved one was very significant in their life, going to the grocery store is hard, because you may not be ready to see people and to tell the story about your loved one, or to hear them say maybe trite comments. A fellow who was a manager of a grocery store on one occasion had somebody say, there's this crazy lady over there on aisle 3. She's in the middle of the floor, and she's holding a box of Golden Flakes. Cereal, not chips, but cereal. And she's just on the floor crying. And he said, okay, I'll take care of it. Went over, sure enough, there she is. That manager got down on his hands and knees and got beside her and put his arms around her, because he realized, knowing who the lady was, that this was the first time she had been back in the store since the death of her little child, who loved that cereal. And so there he was. Now, he did the right thing. He didn't say anything. He just did the right thing by showing his care and concern for her. And so getting better may mean going back, or going to church services, or beginning to go back to work. Even in our civilized society, you typically don't get more than 2, maybe 3 days of bereavement, depending upon where you work. You might get a week in some cases, but typically you don't. And so getting better may mean you can begin to go back and begin to do some of those things that you used to do. And then finally, he says, you try to get beyond, not getting over, because you're not going to get over it. You don't want to get over it. You want to go through grief, and you want to grow through grief, but you don't want to get over it in the sense of forgetting those things that person has done. And so that's what a person should seek to do. And it's really, really important that we try to keep that in mind. Notice that there's no time frame here. It's your time frame. You're working on your time frame, not on someone else's. Any questions or any comments about this before we take a little break and then come back for our final session tonight? Well, If not, let's take a little break and then we will come back and we will deal with how do people make it through the grief journey. Thank you again so much for being here.